Choi Jin had a rule about black women. He didn't date them, he didn't hire them, and he certainly didn't let them near the inner workings of his syndicate. It wasn't a topic he debated. It was a cold, silent law, as permanent as the koi and floral tattoos that climbed his neck and shadowed his jaw. It was the concrete foundation of a life built on intense control and possessive power in the heart of Seoul. But his mother had never cared for his rules. "One date, Jin. That is all I am asking," she said. Her voice sliced through the sterile silence of his penthouse like a blade through silk. Jin didn't look up. He adjusted his white shirt, the fabric strained against his inked chest. On his monitors, numbers scrolled, clean profits masking the grit of the underworld. The family business was a hungry beast that required his total focus. "No," he replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Her name is Rita," his mother continued, unfazed. "She is a doctor, brilliant, elegant. She has a strength that matches yours." I said no. His mother set her teacup down with a sharp clack that echoed against the glass walls. At 72, she was still as lethal as broken glass. "Your father's legacy is at stake, Jin. The council thinks you are isolated. They see a king with no queen and no heir. They see weakness." She stood up, smoothing her expensive dress. "One blind date. If you hate her, I will never speak of it again. But if you don't show up, I am handing the Gangnam operations to your cousin, Sungmin." The threat landed like a heavy fist to the stomach. Gangnam was Jin's territory, the clubs, the high-stakes real estate, the very pulse of his power. Sungmin was a fool who would burn it all to the ground in a month. Jin's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a possessive fire. He was being backed into a corner by a woman he couldn't kill, forced to meet a woman he swore he'd never want. He didn't know it yet, but within 24 hours, his rules and his world were about to be shattered. The restaurant was one of those places where the silence cost more than the wine. Choi Jin sat at the corner table, his dark black suit sharp against the minimalist white decor. He didn't take off his jacket. He wanted his tattoos hidden, a private armor against a public obligation. He checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, his jaw set in a line of bored irritation. He expected a woman who would be flustered by his presence, someone he could dismiss with a cold nod and a check for the bill. Then the doors opened, and the air in the room seemed to shift. Rita didn't walk, she glided. She wore an elegant dark outfit that clung to her curves in a way that was sophisticated rather than revealing. Her skin was a deep, rich mahogany that caught the dim amber light of the chandelier, and her long, straight black hair flowed over her shoulders like silk. As she approached, Jin noticed the delicate geometric tattoos on her hands, ink that spoke of a different kind of history than his own. He didn't stand. He wanted to maintain the power dynamic, to remain the Mafia boss, even in a silk-lined dining room. But Rita didn't wait for an invitation. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, her movements fluid and entirely devoid of the nervous energy he was used to. "You're late," Jin said, his voice a low, calculated gravel. He didn't look at her, instead focusing on the way the light hit his water glass. "Actually, I'm exactly on time," Rita replied. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made his eyes snap to hers. "You were just early. I assume you like to control the environment before your opponent arrives." Jin finally met her gaze. Her eyes were a dark brown, almost black, and they held a clarity that was unnerving. She wasn't looking at his expensive watch or the prestige of his name. She was looking at him. "This isn't a business meeting," Jin remarked, leaning back, his possessive aura beginning to flare. "Then stop acting like a CEO conducting an audit," she countered, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. She picked up the menu, her hand tattoos shifting with the movement. "I heard you had a rule about women who look like me. I find it interesting that a man with so much ink on his skin has such a narrow view of the world." The comment was a needle under his skin. No one spoke to him like that. Not his underlings, and certainly not a blind date. He felt a spark of raw chemistry, a friction he hadn't prepared for. He had come here to shatter her world with his status, but as she calmly ordered a glass of red wine without asking for his suggestion, he realized his own world was the one with the cracks in it. She wasn't impressed by the boss. She was waiting to see the man. The date ended as abruptly as it had begun, but the silence that followed in Jin's penthouse was different. Usually, the quiet of his home felt like an achievement, a sterile, glass-walled fortress high above Seoul where the air was filtered and the chaos of the streets couldn't reach him. But tonight, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the cold luxury felt hollow. His furniture was designer, his whiskey was aged 30 years, and his surroundings were devoid of a single fingerprint. It was a museum for a man who didn't want to be touched. He kept thinking about the way Rita had looked at him, not with the practiced fear of his subordinates, but with a piercing curiosity that made his tattoos feel like a costume rather than a shield. 3 days later, driven by a restless energy he couldn't name, Jin found himself in Itaewon. He had traded his black suit for a dark hoodie, though the sharp fade of his hair and the intensity of his gaze still marked him as a predator in a world of prey. He was looking for the clinic his mother had mentioned, but he found something else first. The neighborhood where Rita existed when she wasn't being forced onto blind dates. The contrast hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't the polished marble of Gangnam. Here, the buildings were older, the brickwork gritty and stained with the history of 1,000 passing lives. He turned a corner and saw her. She wasn't in an elegant dark dress anymore. She wore scrubs and a heavy coat, standing outside a cramped, steam-filled dumpling shop with a group of elderly residents. He watched from the shadows of an alleyway. The air here smelled of toasted sesame oil, exhaust, and charcoal fires. It was loud, messy, and vibrant. Rita was laughing, her head tilted back, the geometric tattoos on her hands flashing as she gestured toward a woman holding a crying toddler. She reached out, her touch natural and warm, checking the child's temperature with a practiced ease that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with care. In his world, warmth was a sign of a lapse in security. In hers, it was the currency of survival. Jin felt a strange, possessive ache in his chest, not the desire to own her, but a sudden, violent urge to protect the light she carried. He looked at his own hands, the koi fish scales inking his skin, and realized that while he sat on a throne of ice, she was living in the sun. The collision of their worlds wasn't just inevitable, it was a demolition, and for the first time in his life, Choi Jin was tired of being the only one left standing in the ruins. The following Tuesday, the weight of the Itaewon streets pulled Jin back. He found himself standing outside the clinic where Rita spent her weekends, a squat, weathered building with peeling paint and a line of people that stretched around the corner. He didn't come as a boss, and he didn't come as a donor. He stood across the street, leaning against a rusted lamppost, watching the faces of those waiting to get in. They were the invisible people of the city, elderly women with bowed backs, day laborers with coughs that sounded like gravel in a blender, and young mothers clutching feverish infants. As Jin watched, he saw a man in a familiar leather jacket, one of his own mid-level enforcers, patrolling the storefronts adjacent to the clinic. The man didn't use a weapon. He didn't have to. He just held out a hand, and the shopkeepers placed envelopes of cash into it with trembling fingers. It was a scene Jin had authorized 1,000 times from the comfort of his leather chair. To him, it had always been a line item on a spreadsheet, the protection tax that funded his silk suits and his mother's high mountain tea. But seeing it here, in the shadow of Rita's sanctuary, changed the math. He watched a young woman step out of the clinic, holding a prescription slip. She walked toward the local pharmacy, but stopped when she saw the enforcer. She checked the meager coins in her purse, looked at the man, and then looked at the clinic door. She didn't buy the medicine. She turned toward the subway, her head hung low, the tax of Jin's empire having just cost her child's health. Jin felt a sickening jolt of recognition. The gritty brick of this neighborhood wasn't just an aesthetic contrast to his life. It was the wreckage he had helped create. The clinic door swung open, and Rita stepped out to call the next patient. She looked exhausted. Her straight black hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and there were faint shadows under her eyes. She paused for a moment, her gaze scanning the street until it landed directly on him. She didn't smile, and she didn't look surprised. She looked at him with a profound, quiet sadness, as if she could see the envelopes of cash hidden in his family's history. For the first time, the koi tattoos on his neck felt like a brand of shame rather than a mark of status. He wasn't a protector. He was the predator. The mirror Rita held up to his life didn't show a powerful heir or a fierce king. It showed a man whose throne was built on the backs of the very people she was trying to save. As their eyes locked across the crowded street, the cold foundation of his world didn't just crack, it began to crumble. Rain began to fall, turning the gritty brick of Itaewon into a dark, shimmering landscape. Jin waited until the last patient had shuffled out and the clinic lights dimmed before he crossed the street. He found Rita at the back entrance, leaning against the doorframe, watching the downpour. She didn't look startled when his shadow fell over her. She simply adjusted her coat, the delicate floral tattoos on her hands catching the pale light of the street lamp. "I saw you watching," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched into her features. "I saw you watching your men take the money that could have paid for the medicine I just prescribed." Jin felt the familiar urge to deflect, to use the sharp, possessive authority that usually silenced his critics. "It's how the city works, Rita. It's a machine. I didn't build it, I just keep it running." Rita stepped forward, moving out of the shelter of the doorway and into the rain. She looked up at him, her dark skin glistening with moisture, her presence so strong it seemed to push back the cold. "Don't give me the script, Jin. I've spent my life healing bodies broken by machines like yours. I don't want to know the boss. I want to know why a man with art on his skin and fire in his eyes spends his life hiding behind a mask of ice." She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the koi tattoos on his neck, but she didn't touch him. The restraint was more agonizing than a blow. "I don't do half-truths, and I don't do shadows. If you want to be in my world, if you want to be with me, the price is the truth, all of it. The blood, the money, the names. You have to decide if you love your empire more than you love your soul." The air between them crackled with raw chemistry, a magnetic pull that threatened to undo every defense Jin had spent a decade perfecting. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the life he could have. It was a life without the heavy black suit, without the constant scan for assassins, without the dirty origins of his wealth. But it was also a life where he would be vulnerable, stripped of the power that had been his only certainty. "You're asking me to walk away from everything I am," Jin rasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. "No," Rita countered softly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm asking you to finally become who you were meant to be, but you can't get there while you're holding onto the lies." She turned to walk away, leaving the choice hanging in the damp night air. Jin stood in the rain, the gritty brick of the alleyway pressing in on him. He could stay the king of a hollow mountain, or he could tell the truth and lose everything to find something real. For the first time, the ruthless Choi Jin felt the weight of his own mask, and it was becoming too heavy to carry. The traditional family dinner was held at a private estate tucked away in the hills of Seongbukdong, a place where the air tasted of pine needles and old money. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly formal. Jin's mother sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by the senior elders of the syndicate, and his cousin, Sungmin, whose smirk was as sharp as his tailored suit. They were discussing logistics and territorial expansion, the cold business of power, until the heavy oak doors opened. Jin entered first, his presence commanding, but it was the woman beside him who stopped the conversation mid-sentence. Rita stood tall, her dark skin a stunning contrast to the pale silk of her dress, her long hair swept back to reveal the calm strength in her eyes. Jin didn't lead her in, they walked in as equals. He felt the collective intake of breath, the silent weight of his rule being shattered in front of the very people who enforced it. "Jin," his mother said, her voice like the click of a safety being disengaged. "You are late, and you have brought a guest." "I have brought the woman I intend to marry," Jin replied. He pulled out a chair for Rita, his movements deliberate. The room erupted in a low, dangerous murmur. Sungmin laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "You're joking," Sungmin sneered, leaning forward. "The heir to the Choi legacy, bringing a doctor from the slums to a council table. You're losing your mind, Jin, or maybe just your grip on reality." Jin didn't look at his cousin. He looked at the elders, men who had known him since he was a child, men who valued tradition over life itself. Then he looked at Rita. She remained perfectly composed, her hand resting on the table, the geometric tattoos on her fingers visible to everyone. She wasn't a victim of their judgment, she was the judge of their world. "This table is built on secrets and blood," Jin said, his voice echoing with a finality that silenced the room. "I spent my life believing that was the only way to survive. But I'm done. I am not here to ask for your blessing. I am here to tell you that I am walking away." The silence that followed was absolute. His mother's eyes flashed with a mixture of fury and a strange, hidden respect. "If you leave this table, Jin," she warned quietly, "you leave everything. The name, the wealth, the protection. You will be a man with nothing but the ink on his skin." "No," Jin said, reaching across the table to take Rita's hand. The raw chemistry between them was no longer a secret, it was a revolution. "I'll be a man with a soul. Sungmin can have the Gangnam operations. He can have the dirt and the shadows. I'm choosing the light." He stood up, never letting go of Rita's hand. As they walked out of the room, leaving the empire behind them like a shed skin, Jin felt a lightness he had never known. The table was broken, the mask was gone, and for the first time in his life, the ruthless Choi Jin felt truly powerful. The descent from the heights of the underworld was not a quick fall, but a slow, agonizing grind. Over the following months, Jin's life became a series of erasures. He spent his days in the back rooms of law offices and the basements of accounting firms, systematically undoing everything he had built. He signed away the deeds to the neon-lit clubs in Gangnam, shuttered the shell companies that laundered the syndicate's breath, and handed over the keys to the high-rise penthouse that had been his glass-walled cage. Each signature was a loss of weight, yet each one felt like a phantom limb being severed. He moved into a small, drafty apartment in a neighborhood where no one bowed when he walked by. The silk suits were replaced by cotton and denim, the expensive whiskey by bitter tea. For the first time, Jin understood the true cost of a clean soul. It was paid for in the currency of relevance. Without his title, without the fear he commanded, he was just a man with too many tattoos and a past that haunted his peripheral vision. There were nights when the silence of his new life felt deafening. He would sit on his small balcony, looking toward the glittering skyline of the city he once thought he owned, his fingers tracing the koi on his neck. The temptation to call his old lieutenants, to reclaim his throne with a single violent decree, was a constant, pulsing itch. But then Rita would arrive, bringing with her the smell of antiseptic and rain, her soft but strong presence grounding him in a way power never could. She didn't offer him pity, she offered him partnership. She watched him struggle with the mundane frustrations of normal life, the utility bills, the crowded subways, the budget spreadsheets that actually had to balance. When his hands shook with the withdrawal from his old life, she would simply take them in hers, her geometric tattoos interlocking with his floral ink. "The ghost of the man you were is trying to scare the man you're becoming," she told him one evening as they shared a simple meal on his cramped kitchen table. "Let him scream. He has nowhere left to go." Jin looked at her, seeing the exhaustion she carried from the clinic and the unwavering belief she had in him. The fortune was gone, the empire was a memory, and his name was no longer a threat. But as he watched the light catch the mahogany of her skin, he realized he wasn't descending at all. He was finally finding his footing on solid ground. The grit of the brick beneath him was real, and for the first time, so was he. 6 years of peace had a way of dulling a man's survival instincts, replacing the hypervigilance of a predator with the quiet contentment of a father. Jin's life was now measured in small, luminous moments. The scent of breakfast that Rita cooked on Sunday mornings, the weight of a grocery bag instead of a weapon, and the high-pitched laughter of their daughter, Jiwon. He had traded the cold steel of a skyscraper for a modest home with a small yard, where the only thing he fought was the stubborn weeds in the garden. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, Jin stood at the edge of the schoolyard, waiting for the bell to ring. He looked like any other father in the crowd, a man in a simple charcoal sweater, his neck tattoos partially obscured by a scarf, his expression soft as he watched children play. He felt a vibration in his pocket. Expecting a text from Rita about dinner, he pulled out his phone. The message was from an unknown number. There was no text, only a single image. The air seemed to vanish from Jin's lungs. The photo was taken from a high angle, likely from one of the buildings overlooking the playground. In the center of the frame was Jiwon, her dark curls bouncing as she chased a friend, her bright yellow backpack a vibrant target against the gray pavement. But it wasn't just a photo of his daughter. Superimposed over her chest was a digital red crosshair, steady and precise. In an instant, the ordinary magic of Jin's new life shattered. The warmth he had spent years cultivating evaporated, replaced by a familiar icy coldness that started in his marrow and flooded his veins. His eyes, once soft with paternal pride, sharpened into the deadly focus of the man he had tried to bury. He scanned the surrounding rooftops with a mechanical efficiency, his possessive instinct flaring into a white-hot protective rage. He saw her then, Jiwon, oblivious and happy, running toward him as the school doors opened. She shouted "Appa!" and threw herself at his knees. Jin scooped her up, his grip perhaps a fraction too tight, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her small back. He buried his face in her hair, smelling the innocent scents of crayons and sunshine, while his mind raced through a list of names he hadn't spoken in half a decade. Park Min-soo, it had to be, the associate he had cast out when he dismantled the Gangnam operations, the man who had lost everything when Jin chose to go clean. The shadow had finally caught up to the light, as Jin walked Jiwon toward their car. His body shielding hers from every possible line of sight, he realized the long descent wasn't over. He had won his soul, but now he would have to fight a ghost to keep his heart. Jin didn't tell Rita about the photo. He couldn't, not yet. To speak the threat aloud would be to invite the darkness back into their sanctuary, and he needed her hands to stay steady for the patients who relied on her. Instead, he waited until she was safely tucked into bed with Jiwon. Then he stepped out into the night, his movements fluid and silent, the phantom weight of a weapon he no longer carried itching at his hip. The trail led him back to the places he had vowed to forget. He moved through the neon-slicked alleys of the city's underbelly, a ghost haunting his own former kingdom. He didn't ask questions with his voice. He asked them with his presence. The sight of the koi tattoos on his neck, illuminated by the flickering light of cheap signage, sent tremors through the men who still inhabited the shadows. They remembered the ruthless Choi Jin, even if he had been living as a ghost for 6 years. Finally, he found the location, a derelict hotel on the edge of the industrial district, a place where the air smelled of rust and desperation. He climbed the stairs, his heart drumming a steady, lethal rhythm. He stopped at room 402. He didn't knock. He kicked the door once, the wood splintering under the force of a man protecting his world. Park Min-soo was sitting on a stained mattress, a laptop open in front of him, the screen still glowing with long-lens photos of Jin's family. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a frantic, localized insanity. He scrambled for a handgun on the nightstand, but Jin was faster. In a blur of motion, Jin had Min-soo pinned against the wall, his hand crushed around the other man's throat. The familiar rush of adrenaline, the dirty origin of his nature, surged through Jin's veins. It would be so easy. A quick twist, a sudden snap, and the threat to his daughter would be extinguished forever. He could feel the killer clawing at the inside of his chest, demanding to be let out, whispering that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Min-soo gasped for air, his face turning a bruised purple, his eyes mocking. "Do it," Min-soo wheezed. "Show them who you really are. Show your queen what you're made of." Jin's fingers tightened. The gritty brick of the room seemed to pulse with the heat of his rage. He was standing on the precipice, the mask of the peaceful father slipping, revealing the monster underneath. He looked at the photo of Jiwon on the laptop screen, then back at the pathetic man in his grip. He realized that if he killed Min-soo here, in this dark, hollow place, he would be killing the man Rita loved just as surely as he was killing his enemy. He was a breath away from losing the soul he had spent 6 years trying to save. The predator's grip remained tight, but Jin's eyes shifted from the trembling man to the laptop screen. He saw the ordinary magic of his daughter's smile, a world built on Rita's demand for honesty, and his own agonizing climb toward the light. If he snapped Min-soo's neck, he would be stepping back into the shadows, proving that the Mafia boss was merely wearing a father's skin. He would be handing Min-soo the ultimate victory, the destruction of Choi Jin's soul. Slowly, Jin opened his hand. Min-soo slumped to the floor, gasping and clutching his throat, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. "I'm not that man anymore," Jin said, his voice a low, resonant calm that carried more authority than 1,000 threats. He reached into his jacket, but instead of a blade, he pulled out a thick envelope of cash, the last of his emergency reserves. He dropped it on the stained mattress next to the laptop. Take it. Leave Seoul. Go to a place where no one knows the name Choi Jin. If I ever see your shadow near my family again, I won't kill you. I'll make sure you disappear so completely that even the ghosts won't find you. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the past, walking out of the derelict hotel and into the cool morning air. The sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the gritty brick of the city in hues of gold and amber. When he returned home, the house was quiet. He stood in the doorway of Juwon's room, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest as she slept, her yellow backpack slumped in the corner. Rita appeared beside him, her soft but strong presence a balm to his frayed nerves. She looked at his bruised knuckles, then into his eyes, searching for the man she loved. "Is it over?" she whispered, her delicate hand tattoos resting against his arm. "It's over," Jin replied, pulling her close. "The cycle is broken." Years later, Jin sat in a plastic chair far too small for his frame in a crowded elementary school auditorium. He wasn't a king, a boss, or a shadow. He was just a man in a simple sweater, his floral tattoos peeking from his collar as he clapped frantically for a little girl playing a flower in a school play. Beside him, Rita beamed with pride, her hand locked in his. As Juwon took her bow, Jin realized that this was his real legacy. It wasn't an empire of fear or a mountain of dirty money. It was the right to stand in the light, to protect without destroying, and to love without a mask. He was no longer the ruthless boss who swore off the world. He was a man who had found everything in the one person he was never supposed to meet. He was, finally and truly, the luckiest man alive.